So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to direct your attention to the giant thing I have up here where it says Spotlight on Shelly Bond. Let's welcome Shelly Bond. You don't care who I am, but I am Laurenn McCubbin. I'm the chair of comics at CCAD. Hi. Okay. So one of the reasons that I was super excited to talk to Shelly, aside from that I think that Shelly is amazing, is because Shelly and I worked together 1,000,000 years ago. So now this is my chance to be mean to her.
Whoa. Oh, God, I knew this was coming, by the way. Oh, I so know this was coming. I made her redraw a panel. Like 4 times.
Yeah, like 4 or 5 times.
4
and I was
times.
just like, why?
Yeah,
Does this
she
woman
was
hate
like,
me?
who is this woman and how could she?
This is just not working for me. This is just not. What if you tried harder?
Right? And then she thanked me later when she saw her work in print, and it looked magnificent.
It did look magnificent. So, okay, let's see if I can
Editors
forward this.
are bossy, and we seem mean, but you'll thank us later.
So I'm going to do a little history of Shelly Bond for those of you who do not know Shelly Bond's entire history. So right out of college, first off, you should absolutely get Shell's, that's not you.
Yeah, no,
Shelly's
no.
new book. Which you don't have with you. Oh, Fast Times. Which was a Kickstarted book, which we'll talk about a little bit as well, but kind of details Shelly's life in early in comics, the kind of like the first decade or so. Yeah, the first decade of comics. But one of the things that I think is really remarkable that no one talks about when they talk about Shelly Bond is that Shelly started at Comico, not Comico.
Oh God, no.
Comico, and there is a very funny joke in Shelly's book about this. So right out of college, Shelly was working as an assistant editor.
Au contraire.
No?
Editorial assistant.
Okay.
Big difference.
Yes.
Editorial assistant answered the phone, so when people would call and say, is this Comico? I would say, no, it's Comico. And then they would say, are you sure? Yes, I'm paid to answer phones. So I would answer the phone, I would stuff the comps into mailers and staple them to send to the artists and writers.
But also, your first job in comics was working under Diana Schutz.
Yes.
Who just won the Eisner for Lifetime Achievement in Comics. Diana.
She was inducted to the Hall of Fame.
The Hall of Fame, yes.
Yes.
The Eisner, and so which it was a part of the Eisner Awards.
Yes.
And then Comico went through some issues.
Basically, Chapter 11 and then Chapter 7, bankruptcy.
Yes, and Diana and Bob Schreck, thank you. I'm never sure how to pronounce that name. Bailed for Dark Horse and Portland.
Yes.
Leaving you.
Well, not just me. I have to give props to the art director of Comico. His name is Rick Taylor, and he taught me everything I know about art and graphic design. So I always love to thank Diana for opening the door and for hiring a goth kid right out of college. I mean, if you remember Robert Smith, that was me. I had big black hair, I had like tons of mascara, silver lipstick, and I don't know why, but she took a chance on me, and I'm forever grateful. But Rick Taylor and I ran Comico for the last year that it was still standing in Norristown, Pennsylvania. So I learned how to edit really trial by fire, and through luck and help from lots of people, lots of artists and writers who stuck with Comico till the bitter end.
And then a brief foray into television production, like local television production.
Right.
And then Vertigo. So that's a big leap, y'all. Starting as an assistant editor with Karen Berger. Here, I'm gonna do this, but I'm gonna make it the surprise, which is.
I hope it's a picture of Karen and not me.
No. Oh, dang it. Sorry. Not used to this mouse. There we go. Just a few,
So cool.
just a few of the books that Shelly has. Let me just give you a list. So. Started as assistant editor, becoming executive editor 21 years later, and then leaving Vertigo 3 years after that. Here are just some of the title highlights. Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, including a number of the Death miniseries and Sandman overtures. Peter Milligan's Shade the Changing Man, Sandman Mystery Theater with Matt Wagner. And yes, also, I put our copy of Madame Xanadu right there, which also with Matt Wagner. I, Zombie with Mike Allred. Heavy Liquid with Hometown Boy, Paul Pope. Fables, Ed Brubaker's earliest mainstream comics. The reprint of Moonshadow and its sequel, which is like really near and dear to my heart because John J. Muth is a genius. Mike Carey's Lucifer, and Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. Plus, I like to say that you solidified your indie cred by asking Peter Bagg and Gilbert Hernandez to do a kids book for DC. And I like, and like you sought them out.
Yeah.
You like were really like, no, we should do this.
Well, yeah. I mean, to be really honest, I was not into superheroes ever. I think the only superhero book that really impressed me was Bill Willingham's Elementals when I was at Comico. It was like nothing else I ever read at all in the world, not just in comics. I just thought it was so smart and snarky, and I thought he was really subverting what superheroes have been, and it was everything that I didn't expect, so I loved it. And that's also been sort of my MO as an editor. I love seeing things that no one has ever attempted, and I think people really, like when people have the guts to put out something completely different, I think that's cool, even if it's not for me, even if it doesn't resonate with me, but having guts, that's what I really respect.
You have continued your career post Vertigo. You were at IDW for a short time with Black
Crown.
I always want to say Black Mask, and that's a very different thing.
Well, using the word black with black and white comics is common. A lot of people, there have been a lot of companies that have used black with another word. But Black Crown,
right? Real
quickly, it was our dream come true. The day that I left Vertigo, got an email from Chris Ryle from IDW, and I couldn't pick him out in a police lineup. I knew his name, but I didn't know who he was in comics. And he said, look, I'm bummed you're not going to be at Vertigo. Followed your books, your whole career. If you want to stay in comics, please talk to me. So I sent him a resume when I was out of my contract, and sure enough, he said, I want a Shelly Bond imprint. So I contacted the closest artist to me at the time, which happened to be my husband. I'm kidding.
Very close.
Always wanted to work with my husband to make comics, and so we did, and I have to give him all the props. I always tell people I married my favorite artist. It's true that he did a Shade the Changing Man fill-in, and the pages landed on my desk, and I went berserk. The little hearts popped out of my eyes. Now, I had no idea who he was. I knew he was British, so we already got 2 points right there. But I didn't know him at all. I just knew I loved his work. And honestly, I didn't care what he looked like, how old he was. I just knew this guy's art moved me. So I spent many, many years just trying to hire him to do jobs. He was voted the slacker artist of the decade. So to get him to finish a job was a bloody miracle. And that's even before I met him at a convention. I just loved his art. It just inspired me. It represented everything about my modern aesthetic.
Can I grab your mic thing?
Yes.
Because you keep bumping it with your hand.
No,
Monster.
I don't talk with my hands.
Yes.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure that it's there.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I don't. Okay.
Okay. So you have had this amazing career, and I'd like to say like the closest kind of thing when you think about editors, right? Like they're the secret power behind some really great books, but like you had like an amazing run, and I like to make it akin to like a producer, but like somebody like a Brian Eno or a Alan Moulder or a Steve Albini.
Okay, wait.
Which is
I want to take the Eno. I'm going to take the Eno and run. My husband bought me this pin for my birthday one year, and so yeah, that I've never been compared to Eno, so I'm taking that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, because like it's like, oh, I love this band. I don't know anything about who like made this band what they are, but like your role as an editor was incredibly, I don't want to say like powerful, but like you really had a hand on the books in a way that we, A, do not see anymore, and B, like really wasn't even common in comics. It's much more of a like book publishing.
Yeah, or record producing, like you
said.
said.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I wrote Filth and Grammar, one of the things I wanted to do most of all was to have a page that had all of the roles of the comic book editor. So I put in the very early part of the book, the comic book editor by definition. And there, you know, I start with, it's the greatest job that no one knows about. Now, that's how it was for me in the 90s, and I liked it that way. It made me feel special. But to be honest, now it's much more common, but when you think about it, in so many companies today, an editor is a facilitator. Maybe gets the invoice in and gets people paid and maybe gives the deadlines. But the kind of editing I do is really hands-on, and it's more like showrunner, to be honest. And I feel lucky, but look, when I got to Vertigo, I was the last original team member to join the Vertigo crew in December of '92, and I was also the last of the original members to be laid off from the company in 2006. But I will tell you that the only reason I was able to like go up the ladder was because I worked nonstop. You know, what I talk about in Fast Times, which is like a love letter to like comics in the 90s in New York City. I didn't have much of a life outside of DC Comics proper, the office building, because I had a lot of responsibility. I was lucky because when Karen Berger hired me, she had already designed the imprint. So I kind of came in just to kind of wave and, you know, take all the accolades. But she was very busy in those early days as an executive editor. You know, she'd have to report to the sales team. She'd have to go to meetings all day. So of course she did a lot of the front end script editing, but then there was me. So I was an assistant editor, but I was definitely doing more than the job of an assistant. And it paid off because she knew she could trust me, and you know, respect is earned. So I wanted to show her that I was already an editor at Comico. I kind of knew what I was doing, and once I proved it to her, she let me run. So I always have to thank her for that. Like, she trusted me, and I was able to go up the ranks, not as fast as I would have liked, but I was a woman in comics. You know, it wasn't easy, but I really do look back at my career there, and I'm proud of every book and every stage of comics making.
It's and you I'm just going to forward to this because I just kept stealing stuff. This is all from Shelly's book. Okay, so sorry. This is the thing I was supposed to show you. That was like, hey, here's Shelly's recent work with Off Register Press, and we'll come back to this because I wanted to talk about the fact that I keep hitting the wrong button. You worked with some legends at DC. This is a page from Shelly's. Not Filth and Grammar from Fast Times, which here we've got Matt Wagner, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, Peter Milligan, and Karen Berger down here real small. Wow. But like all of these people, like you walked into a relationship with all of these people.
Well, I had to cultivate that relationship, and the number one thing that I have to say is that they were all so cool and so intimidating, and the provocateurs of postmodern comics. So believe me when I tell you, I was shaking in my shoes, but we had so many things in common. I loved British music, so I could break the ice on day one, and that really helped. But also, I loved their work, and I just wanted to make it better, look better, read better. And I just from the beginning picked up the phone. And I think a lot of people in comics back in those days were afraid. And I can understand it, but I was raised by a businessman who took no prisoners, made no excuses, and pretty much pushed me off the high dive when I was a very young girl and said, you know, as long as you aren't robbing someone or asking someone an embarrassing question, just go in there, go get them, don't be afraid. And I wasn't, so I just did it. Also, don't forget, there was just the phone. There was no Zoom chat. So I could just be charming because I didn't have to look them in the eye. Because let me tell you, I would have melted had I looked at Grant Morrison in the eye and would have just been a puddle. But they're great people. And I love to say that when it comes to Neil, I met Neil and Dave McKean on my first day on the job, like legit in the hallway. They were being brought upstairs, into Karen's office. And my eyeballs popped out. I picked them up on the floor. And I have to say that they were both so nice, and Neil is exactly as you see him on social media. He is just a terrific person. He loves comics, and he cares about comics. And that's not true about everyone, but it's true about him.
Fantastic. Okay, so legend, and then you also worked with, I just have to do this, a legend to be. Gerard Way was an intern at DC Comics. So please, for the kids, tell us a Gerard Way story. Well, as an intern.
As an intern, I have to confess that by the time I was editing The Invisibles, I was a bit of a snob. Imagine that. I mean, I was the person who, when I was asked if I wanted to take over The Invisibles, just so you know the context, Stuart Moore was the first editor of The Invisibles. So he really worked with Grant on the early concept, and it was always envisioned as a trilogy. But Stuart was given the opportunity to actually run the first science fiction comic book line. And he was a science fiction book editor. So you can only imagine his joy. So Karen had asked me to come into her office, and she said, well, I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but Stuart is very, very busy. How would you like to take over The Invisibles with Volume 2? Honestly, it's that moment where you're like, did someone just say that, or did I think that? I'm like, yes. Oh my God, yes. And she said, okay, cool. So meanwhile, I was the girl in the neon pink dress, into all the themes of The Invisibles. I loved Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius. I loved Philip K. Dick. I thought Grant was the end all. Still do, think he's a genius. So I'm like, yes, Grant. But then, of course, she said, well, it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a little different because Volume 2, he has a different vision. So it was an honor. And it was just, like I said, a career highlight. That dovetails into Gerard Way because Gerard was a huge Grant Morrison fan. Imagine that. And then he eventually took over Doom Patrol. I had a part in that. Trust me. When Gerard was at the School of Visual Arts, he wasn't Vertigo's intern. He interned with his teacher, Joey Cavalieri, who was a DC Universe editor. And the DC Universe and Vertigo were on different floors. So I remember just kind of walking around in my mod boots and my mini dresses. There used to be a kid, and I'm talking like I thought maybe he was 12, kid, okay? Like dark hair, lots of mascara. And I thought he just was someone's kid lost in the building. And it was Gerard Way before he was My Chemical Romance. And I would see this kid, and I'd see him in the hallway, and then he'd be gone. And so I'd be in my office, and my office had music posters from all of my books. I'm a huge Love and Rockets fan, huge David Lapham fan. So that's why I reached out to Gilbert Hernandez and Peter Bagg to work with me, because I read Hate. So, I read 8 Ball. Those were my books. So I tried to bring that indie vibe in, and that's what Gerard was reading too. So he would sneak around, and eventually one day he walked into my office, and I'm like, can I help you? And he's like, I'm Joey Cavalieri's intern. I'm like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. And he's like, I love your books. Well, years later, he came into the office to meet with me, and it was just amazing. I apologized for being such a diva, and he and I we clicked, as like just having similar tastes and interests, and loved Bowie and loved the British invasion music of the 90s. And we said we'd always want to work together. And so it almost happened. Back in 2015, we chatted and stayed in touch over the years, but we talked about him doing his own imprint, which became Young Animal. So I had the pleasure of actually putting Young Animal together and editing the first 2 Doom Patrol scripts. And I was the one who suggested to him that he take over Doom Patrol again for Grant, because A, he loved Grant's series. He and I both said that the Doom Patrol run with Richard Case, Grant Morrison, Richard Case, is the seminal run, and it's a masterclass in comic book storytelling, because it's every single issue is a self-contained story, even though it's linked to a longer storyline. So if anyone in the audience wants to learn how to write a self-contained issue, buy any of those comics, and some of them are like you can find for $1 now. Please read them, because that will teach you how to write a single issue. So it was all about the connection, it was all about the connection to Grant and music and comics. So that's my story.
Well, okay, so I have a question about, I just want to double check my time. See, I have to do it too.
Okay.
I have a question about, like, so what is it like to start an imprint? Like, what does that mean? What is the work in that? And then also, like launching that, and what are the discussions, not just with the higher ups about like why this should happen, but also with the imprint creator about what it is that they want to accomplish?
Well, honestly, I've always had a very specific idea of what I wanted to do with comics. And basically, it's, I'm loyal to comics now because it's the ultimate art form. Full stop. It just is. And I'm a paper purist, although I can say digital is fine as well. But to me, it's the power of the page turn. And I love the periodical. I'm an art snob. I'm an art director and design snob. So yes, I love the ribbon on the book, and I love the Smythe sewn binding that allows you to open the book and it stays flat, and you don't lose the copy in the creep in the middle. But when I'm coming up with an imprint, usually I'm thinking about it for a while, but I am an organizational freak, and I like a long lead time. It's important. So I might start thinking about an imprint 2 years before I'm going to actually pitch it to someone, and I'm just taking notes, and I'm just putting my thoughts down. But I always go for broke, and I'm going to blame my dad again, because, why not ask Paul Pope to be one of the main people on the imprint? I didn't always know him, and actually he was brought to my attention. Karen Berger's husband, who was the art director at DC, his name is Richard Bruning. He met Paul and thought that Paul and I would have a lot in common. We share the same birthday. One of us is older. I'm not going to say which one. And we loved David Bowie, like old Bowie, like 1970 to 1980. So he thought we would actually get along with each other. I was reading 2HB. So I was like, that Paul Pope? And he was like, yeah. I'm like, oh my God, bring him on. And I want to talk to him about how he handles eyes on his characters. So I was already going in when I was sitting down with Paul Pope, and I was like, oh, I love your work so much. If I can ask you for one thing, can I ask you to do this, this, and this? And we just clicked, because I'm a straight up editor. So I'm from the school of, this is my dream project. You only live once. So I approach everything I do like that. I'm not intimidated by most people in the world. I'm not, because I really do feel like we're human and everybody is equal. And it doesn't hurt to ask, as my dad would say. So yeah, that's why I would get people to work with me. Also, I get shit done, and I like working with people who show up and do the work. There will always be people who are smarter and faster and more talented, but the people you remember take it from idea to finish. And that's the number one thing that people are sometimes afraid to do, is finish a project, get to the next step. I'll end this thought with my favorite Andy Warhol. I'm going to misquote him, but Andy Warhol said, don't be afraid about making art, because you just need to be moving on to the next piece of art. Let people start criticizing your art while you've already left them in the dust and you're working on your next project. It's not having any fear and getting it done, and do it for you, and unite people that you think can change the world on paper.
Well, fantastic. Okay, so talking about working with people who maybe, you have to be like, hey, I'm going to poke you.
Uh-oh.
So J.H. Williams, famously, amazing artist, slow as molasses.
Well, actually, I will tell you a story about J.H. First of all, it's always Bowie that connects me to everyone. It's very rare for people not to like some phase of Bowie, whether it's recent stuff or even maybe the more commercial era with Let's Dance and that stuff. But J.H. Williams, straight off the bat, said to me, I can paint 2 pages a week. And I said, okay. He said, this is what I do. And the reason why people think I'm slow is because they don't believe me. And so I said, well, let's just put together a schedule that honors your honesty. So that's what we did. Now, of course, there are always other variables, because the writer's late sometimes. And also, if you don't have a long lead time and your publisher doesn't believe that you can't put it out monthly, it's not physically possible if the artist paints a certain way. We're expecting this quality. So I think he gets a bad rap. He really isn't slow, and he was always straight up. So I built a schedule around that, and I told my bosses, hey, this is happening. Sometimes bosses hear and they don't listen. So the editor takes the fall, the editor takes the blame, and that's my job. You have to, when you're an editor, honestly, it doesn't matter how tall or small you are Teflon. And Dan DiDio once called me unflappable, and I said, you bet. You cannot be afraid to step up and swing in comics, and I wasn't, and I'm not.
Okay, so you've got a thing where you're like, okay, I've built the schedule, right? And I know that this is going to be coming in at the pace that it comes in. What do you do with someone who's maybe, you have a lovely comic about it in Fast Times, where you talk about trying to get pages out of Grant Morrison.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, the thing about Grant that was a shame during the Invisibles days is that he actually was taking care of a lot of cats. And his cats were his babies. And so sometimes he was legit running to the vet with the cats because many of them were sick. And so when it came to trying to get pages out of him, I would talk to him maybe just about like getting a lot of other things done while I was waiting for pages. And it really helped us with the third arc because we actually broke it down into different minis within minis, if that makes sense. So we knew that Philip Bond was going to do a substantial part of that run, but then we also had this weird idea, like, let's just have a bunch of people come in and do like 1 page each. So you come up with ways to actually get a lot of people working so that the stuff's coming in, and then you can figure out where it fits. So I think a lot of the Invisibles, because it was such an out there concept, Grant was really open to being experimental with how it was coming together and how we would end it. Counting down to the millennium, I knew was going to be a crapshoot, but it was the millennium. Like, maybe we weren't going to be here on January 2nd. And also, come on, let's talk about 2012. We were also counting down to that too. So it just seemed like the subject matter was begging for something bizarre. So, the trick is when you see trouble, when people blow deadlines, get them help. Most of my books, I relied on people like Peter Gross, who would do amazing roughs or thumbnails. Just the foundational part of a comic book page, nailing the roughs is the first and most important part of making sequential art. So I had a whole stable of people who were my go-to people to help me get ahead on projects. So that was one way of getting ahead. The other was to kind of put a fill-in issue or a guest artist issue in a run. And that was my saving grace on Lucifer. So that's how Dean Ormston actually started his career. He was a terrific artist. Nobody really knew his stuff. We hired him to do our Lucifer guest artist issues. He was so good, we actually hired him for the whole run, and Peter Gross actually did roughs for him to help him sort of segue in nicely to Peter's art. So it just became this great extended family. And that's, I think, what I hope part of my legacy is at Vertigo, is bringing in different voices, different art styles, integrating them within the whole world building setup of whether it was Fables or Lucifer or Invisibles, and just kind of adding to the collective family and celebrating collaboration. Because that's comics. Even if you're a cartoonist and you do everything yourself, hopefully you're working with an editor, so it's still collaborative. And you have the reader too. So that's participatory for the reader.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about physical art, because this is a very, very digital age for comics, in that a lot of people only work digitally. One of the things about my program that we really emphasize is that you have to start your first 2 years doing it pen and ink before we let you move to digital. But there's an old school way of doing this, and I said, Shelly, please explain this to the children. What is that?
Well, that is honestly, those are the four chambers of my heart. And again, sorry about talking with my hands. That is a Comico color guide, and honestly, I have two. And I should archive them here at the Billy Ireland, because they mean the world to me. So basically, when Rick Taylor and I were running Comico, I should say with, of course, the Lasorda brothers, they were the owners of Comico. Phil Lasorda was the artist. Dennis Lasorda was the physical therapist. So he was the financial part of the company. But Phil also, both Dennis and Phil have passed on, but I owe them a lot too. They trusted us, and Rick taught me how to color code. And color coding back in those days was, we used this, which shows different ratios of blue, magenta, red, yellow, and K, or black. And it's coded differently than you might think of when you think about Photoshop. Well, what we did in those days is people would use watercolor, and I'm not kidding, like a brush that they would dip into some paint. And as I guess I was really an editor stroke production assistant, I would code those pages on paper. It was Strathmore paper we would run through the copier, and I would have to double check that the colorist coded correctly. Now, every single color for every single image was coded differently. So it was just like pencil with lines pointing to parts of a page. So you could understand colorists would kind of go cross-eyed sometimes, and they would mess up numbers. If you messed up a number percentage, you could expect to see a skin tone that was maybe, a tan color, and it would be hot pink if you messed up a number. So my job was to understand that and to know the difference between B2, M3, and 100% yellow. And that was a big deal. So I prided myself on that. That's how I learned the part of the art side of making comics. And I brought that knowledge to Vertigo, which was very writer-driven. Karen Berger has always been very much the writer's editor. Well, I was a film major in school, and I was on the other side. I was like the artist champion. So I continue to do that with my work at Off Register Press. So of course I married my favorite artist. And of course I love messing with and deconstructing the comic book to make beautiful art.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that physical art in the way that yes, working at a comic book publisher now, everything is going to come in digitally no matter, even if it starts physically. But what did it use? Because there's a fantastic scene in the first part of your book, which I keep telling you guys about this book. I'm really just like, hey, get this book, where you're like running through, and you've got this giant stack of art boards.
Yes.
So what was that process like back in the day?
Well, that was a heavy stack. So that was like 11 by 17 artboard was the standard size, and there were blue lines, or legit just light blue. It was called non-repro, but sometimes it reproduced, because it does. But it would have all of the crops and marks on it, and people would draw directly on the board. And we had 2 different paper stocks. One of the perks of being an artist for DC Comics was the assistant editor would call you and say, do you like rough or smooth board? So the smooth board was always like, most people with pens would want the smooth board. But if you inked with a brush, you would like the rough surface. So the boards were, they weren't heavy unless you were actually working on 6 monthly books, and that was me. Karen and I worked on a lot of books in the early days. I would carry them to production. We would put our notations, we would mark up lettering that was on the board with a non-repro blue pencil, which sometimes reproduced, and I'd have to just be very careful that my handwriting was clear, because these were the notes. We would take them to the production artist to make changes, and that was, not every comic was perfect when it came in. Imagine that. So we would be in charge of corrections. In addition to going over corrections with production, one of my greatest joys, and I'm going to be recounting it in the 3rd part of my editing trilogy, because it's the best, going over corrections on the phone with writers. And Peter Milligan and I, no lie, we averaged about 2.5 hours per issue, because we would laugh. We would just laugh, because sometimes it was like an honest lettering mistake. So it would be a word and it was supposed to say food and it said fart or something, and like we would amuse ourselves with that. But my job was to make sure all the corrections were made and that the printed copy was the perfect copy. So going over corrections was a great part of the job.
Okay, so with that, and you just were able to go visit the Billy Ireland, lovely experience.
Amazing. If you haven't done it, I beg you, please go. It will change your life.
So a lot of this art has moved to digitally, right? To digital art.
Yes.
A lot of artists, comics artists, are working digitally, and we're kind of losing the legacy of the stuff that you see at the Billy, which would include, like, if an artist donates their work, they're going to have these notations that Shelly made,
yeah.
or they're going to have like these comments from the editors that are lost if it's just a PDF.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you were working through the digital transition?
Yes.
Is there anything that you feel like is like, a way to bring that back, or is there anything like a way to like, how do you preserve this ephemera now when it's just all digital? Like, what would you do to preserve your editing notes?
Well, keep making books on editing. I mean, honestly, someone had to do it. And I was very surprised that in the past 10 years, someone else didn't beat me to the punch. But I'm glad. I kind of like being the innovator. And honestly, Filth and Grammar was a long time in the making for me, because right now in comics, I'm mid-century modern. All I want to do is continue to make comics my way and pay it forward to the next generation, because it's important, and I think right now in comics, sadly, I don't think there's a lot of editing going on. I say that because I still walk into comic shops and I open up comics and I don't buy a lot of them, because I don't think the editors some of them are lazy, some of them are just not interested, but most of them don't know that there are rules. And to break the rules, you need to understand the rules, and that's still important. So that's why I came up with Filth and Grammar, because I actually wanted to put everything in print that I learned along the way. If I had an editorial handbook in the 90s, maybe I would be famous right now, but I didn't. And so another reason that I actually reached out to a lot of my friends and professionals to contribute is because I know I didn't do it myself. I had a lot of help from people around me. So this is a celebration of what I've learned and how I edit. And something I tell my editing students, I teach a class called Comics Editing for Portland State in the spring by Zoom. And I also do my own online Zoom classes. And what I tell students is, this is my way, and my way is not the highway. Take what you like from what I do, but bring your own style and method to the table. Other things work too, but this has worked for me, and this is how I do it.
So I just got hey, we've got 5 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions. You have your hand way up first. What's up?
What is the number one common thing that bothers you when you read something? You say that no one edited it.
What is the, okay, so.
I think they are being edited, and I want to know what do you mean by not being edited?
So let me repeat that back. So what is the number one common thing that you think of when you say, oh, this isn't edited? Like, what is the thing that you're seeing?
Too much copy. Balloons everywhere, and you can't appreciate the art. Too much copy. There's overwritten. There's so many word balloons or narrative captions on a page. The art isn't breathing. There is no silent moment in a storyline. There are fonts that are not kerned, so words bleed together, and you're actually not sure what you just read.
So okay, that's
three things.
A fantastic answer. Other questions? Hey, Sky.
So when you were doing color coding back in the day, was the colorist, did they cater their palette to the palette of the printer, or did they just color it and then you would try to get things pretty close?
Well, at Kamiko, we made sure that everyone had one of those, because we wanted to all be on the same page. And that actually is one of my favorite things to share with people. In Filth and Grammar, one of the early parts of the book, I say, always confirm receipt and state your expectations. And so from the very beginning, I would always make sure that anyone we worked with had the same chart. Now, it's different today. Don't follow that chart. But everybody needs to be on the same page. So, yes, that meant fewer errors. But there were always shifts. Printing is not a perfect science.
All right. Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, I was told to repeat everyone's question back, so, okay.
Regarding the long-term archiving of the ephemera we were just talking about, do you save the digital layers? Do you save the notes that you send to artists digitally? I mean, will we move into an era where maybe it's more of a global digital available archive run by the Billy Ireland or whoever? Or is that stuff actually new?
So again, I have to repeat it for the camera. So the question being, again, so are you saving your digital ephemera? Do you save your editor's notes?
I'm a pack rat. So I save everything. And in fact, in the third book of my editing trilogy, there's a lot of that stuff. I've saved boards and I've copied them so that I see all the notes around the edge. But also as an editor, I'm a note taker. And everything I do first in red pen, and sometimes I actually just, mark up directly on the inks, and sometimes I have more extensive notes that I type out. I mean, I do design all my own books now too, so I'm not completely old school, and I do love designing on the computer. But everything for me starts with what's on paper. I proofread on paper, and I beg you, please, if you're an editor or if you're a writer, print it out and proofread it on paper, because sometimes the point size is way too small, not just for you, but for your readers.
Hi there.
I was curious, because all the books and the people you've worked with, super creative, but then, especially in today's day and age, there's a lot of, like, DC and Marvel are such big corporations. As an editor, was there ever any friction between, like, the corporate side of comics and all the great creatives you worked with?
So
manage?
Okay, so this is going to be our last question because I am getting the death glare from the back. We had to start a little late because of technical issues. However, the question was there creative fiction between you and the corporate world of DC?
Well, of course, there will always be creative friction between corporate and creative. However, I will say Vertigo had the advantage. When Paul Levitz and Jeanette Kahn were running DC Comics, they loved Karen Berger and they loved Vertigo. So they were our champions. So I know I was shielded from a lot of drama, and I'm grateful for that.
All right, well, everyone, let's say thank you so much to Shelly Bond for being
And
here.
Laurenn, thank you to you.
Good job, buddy.
Thank
All
you.
right, and so we will now clear the stage for whoever's next.